Hey everybody, it's Innovision, and the official SteamOS launch for non-Steam Deck hardware like the Legion Go and the ROG Ally is so close. In today's video, we'll be taking a close look at performance between Windows 11 and SteamOS on the Legion Go using 3 games across various TDP settings. In today's study, the games we'll be looking at are Elden Ring, the just launched Oblivion Remastered, and TMNT Splintered Fate. We've configured all 3 games to use the exact same settings across both OSes. We're going to show you side-by-side gameplay samples for all 3 of these games using various TDP settings. We've also put together some analysis to help quantify the differences we felt while gaming. Stick around, you don't want to miss any of it. For this video, we're using the latest version of Windows 11, along with the official SteamOS 3.7.5 from the Preview Update channel. While these videos have been a ton of work, they've also been very rewarding. The most rewarding part for me has been the discussions in the comment section. In fact, they help shape today's video. Now, I work full-time and I have a family, so it does take me a little while to put these videos out. For example, this video I started working on 3 weeks ago. Now I want everybody to take a moment to like the video, subscribe, hit me up in the comment section. Let me know if there's anything else you want to see. It could be anything related to handheld gaming, but it doesn't have to be handheld gaming. It could be anything related to computing and technology in general. I'm literally like an encyclopedia when it comes to computing knowledge. Alright, let's get started. The first game we're taking a look at is Elden Ring. And in both OSes we're using integer scaling. I'm using the low graphics quality preset. And the only thing I've changed from the low graphics quality preset is I'm using medium texture quality and medium shader quality. I find in Elden Ring, you're kind of in confined areas typically that don't require large drawing distances unless you're on the world map. And so for these type of settings, it plays very well when you're in a dungeon fighting things up close and personal. And I still can see the detail in my character's shield and armor and things like that. Now let's take a side-by-side look at both OSes, looking at 15, 20, and 25 watt TDP settings. So what we have pulled up on the screen here is a set of graphs showing the average frames per second under Windows 11 and SteamOS. The dark blue bars correspond to our average frames per second in Windows, and the light blue bars correspond to our low 1% frames. Similarly, the red bars correspond to our average frames per second in SteamOS, and the light red corresponds to our low 1% frames. And going from left to right, we've got 15, 20, and 25 watts TDP settings. And so what we can see just right off the bat at the lower TDP settings, Windows is definitely dominating SteamOS here, both in terms of the average FPS and the lows. But what gets interesting here is as we turn up our TDP, SteamOS starts to perform similarly and just maybe slightly better. I wouldn't actually say better here, but comparable, because that 1 frame difference is just kind of noise. Our next set of graphs show the variability in frame rate. So variability here is how much each sample differs from the average of all samples. Again, the dark blue here is Windows 11 and the red is SteamOS. And what we see here is across the board, there's a lot less variability in SteamOS. And to be quite frank with you, Elden Ring is like the model citizen or ideal game for SteamOS. I remember when the game launched, I had a RTX 3080 Ti on a beefy gaming computer, and every time I walked into a new area, this computer was brought down to its knees in stuttering and going down to like 5 frames per second because there's just issues. The game wasn't very well optimized. I think there was only like 1 or 2 rendering threads, and so it would really hurt when you load new textures and you walk into new areas. I remember there was a joke at the time that SteamOS fixed the problems with Elden Ring, but that was just because the way Linux handles, loading textures and shaders, with the Vulkan API, is just 2 different beasts altogether. And so this is an example of a game that I've played a lot on both my gaming PCs and my handhelds, and it just runs very well in SteamOS. Similar to our Elden Ring settings, in Oblivion Remastered, we're using integer scaling in both OSes. That means we're using the 1280 by 800 resolution and using the in-driver scaling to hit the full display resolution. I'm starting with a low graphics quality preset. The only thing I'm bumping up is the post-processing quality to high and texture quality to medium. And that just makes the game look better, like we're not looking at it through a mud puddle. I'm also using FSR 3 frame generation, and I've hand tweaked my own Unreal Engine INI file. So there's different websites out there that have INI file to help enhance the performance of this game. So I made a few more additional optimizations. If there's any interest, I'd be willing to put it on our GitHub one day. I haven't played enough with it to feel, how this is going to work in the ending parts of the game once you're like in the Oblivion gates and stuff, so it needs a little bit more testing. Let's take a side-by-side look at Oblivion Remastered across both OSes using 15, 20, and 25 watt TDP settings. Here we have our graphs pulled up of the average frames per second under both OSes on Oblivion Remastered. Again, we're using the blue color system to encode Windows here and the red to be SteamOS. So our dark blue bar is the average frames per second, and the light blue bar is our low 1% frames. Similarly, our red bar is our average frames per second in SteamOS, and our light red is our low 1%. And then going from left to right, we've got 15, 20, and 25 watt TDP settings. Similar to what we saw with Elden Ring, at lower TDP settings, Windows seems to perform a little better. It does have, I did notice this while playing the game, when you walk into a new area, it definitely stutters more in Windows than in SteamOS. But those highs, it just seems like Windows can sustain those higher frame rates unless you're loading stuff. That's where things get kind of crazy. The other thing I'd like to call out, it's hard to measure, in the side-by-side comparison of this game because there's a bug in syncing my game save file. And so in one of the games, it looks a little bit more pale or gray. I think it's in the SteamOS version. That's because it's foggy and like kind of rainy climate in the game on that game save. But we can see here that Windows typically is performing a little bit better. What's really interesting at 25 watt TDP, both games are staying well into the 60 frames per second. Now with our graph for the frame rate variability, this also tells a very interesting story. Again, blue is our Windows 11 frame rate variability. The red bar is our SteamOS variability. At the 20 watt TDP setting, it's just like there's hardly any variability for both OSes, so it seems like they're the happiest. But then when we bump it up to 25 watts, both of them seem kind of unhappy and have a lot more variability there. Now it's time to take a look at TMNT Splintered Fate. This game is so much fun. It's, for those of you who are not aware of it, it's a roguelike game where you get to play as one of the four brothers, and it is multiplayer. The game is designed to be challenging and tough, where basically if you die, you have to start over again. But what's different compared to some other roguelikes, you get to keep some of your power-ups and upgrades, so that when you start the game over again, you're slightly stronger. It's definitely proved to be challenging. I haven't beaten it yet. It's one I'm going to be playing for a while. It's important to note, for Splintered Fate, we didn't make any settings adjustment. You can actually run the game in windowed or full screen, but I'm just using the full screen resolution of the Legion Go. It is a game that's visually pleasing to the eye, but it's not a very demanding game, and so it can run on the handhelds without much difficulty. Now let's take a look at a side-by-side comparison across both OSes using TMNT Splintered Fate. Here we have our graph of our average frames per second while playing TMNT Splintered Fate. The dark blue bar corresponds to Windows 11 average frames per second, and the light blue corresponds to that low 1% frame. The red bar corresponds to SteamOS's average frames per second, and the light red bar corresponds to our low 1% frames. Going from left to right, we have 15, 20, and 25 watt TDP setting. And this is a game that runs beautifully on SteamOS. It runs quite well on Windows too. I'm not dogging on Windows here, but as you go into new areas, especially at that 15 watt TDP setting, you can see we drop down to 4 frames per second. For some reason, Windows 11 just has a hard time when you're loading into new areas, and I didn't see that drop in frames on SteamOS. And we even hit 70 frames per second at the highest TDP setting there. The game just runs so much smoother there. But we should also take a look at our frame rate variability. So the variability is much higher in SteamOS by the time we get to the 25 watt TDP settings. In this graph, the blue bar corresponds to Windows frame rate variability, and the red bar corresponds to SteamOS's frame rate variability. And you can see at the higher TDP, our variability is almost twice as high compared to Windows. Same with the 20 watts, actually. As the game loads new areas, I didn't feel any stuttering. I do feel that in Windows, like literally it just gives out. This was a very interesting study. In today's video, we saw one game where Windows outperformed SteamOS and 2 games where SteamOS outperformed Windows. The take-home message here, it really depends on the game. Especially for handhelds, there's going to be some games that run better on Linux just because of its management of memory. It has a lighter footprint. The operating system and the kernel doesn't need as much memory to run. And so on a device like the Legion Go, where you only have 16 gigs of RAM and you're sharing it between the graphics card and the main CPU to run your operating system, that's just going to create resource contingency. I am curious how this would run on the Legion Go S that has the Z1 Extreme that's got 32 gigs of RAM that's coming out at the end of this month. That would be an interesting use case because Windows consuming more memory, it might be okay with that additional memory overhead that the new Legion Go is going to have. But also, I've seen some studies done where people have soldered additional memory banks to their Steam Deck, for example, and that extra memory didn't really make any kind of benefit. So it's kind of hit or miss. That was on SteamOS. But I imagine on Windows, we would see an improvement in gameplay with that extra memory. In fact, you do see it with the ROG Ally X, for example. It's got 24 instead of the 16 gigs like the Ally has. And you can dedicate 8 gigs just to the graphics, and that does make a difference. But we'll have to see. I think one of the things that is very demanding and difficult for the Legion Go is that higher resolution display. That higher resolution display is just too much for the graphics card to handle, and so that's why most of the time I'm going around using integer scaling, because I'm essentially rendering everything at 1280 by 800, and so that 1280 by 800 is closer to the Steam Deck resolution. I think that's why we see these a lot smoother gameplay on SteamOS for some of these games. There's another game that comes to mind. Mass Effect runs a lot better on Windows than it does on SteamOS. And then there's another game, I showed it in our last video, Pac-Man World, the repack. That game runs, hands down, it runs way better in Windows. And that's a game that's built on Unity. And so there's a lot of software layers needed to make that game run, and so that can affect things there. Thank you for joining us here today. We hope you enjoyed seeing this performance comparison. Be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, hit me up in the comments section, let me know what you want to see next, so you don't miss out on all the amazing gaming tips, tricks, and mods we've got coming down the pipeline.